Good evening and welcome. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Axel Springer lecture entitled War Unbound, which will be delivered by Oona Hathaway, the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law. It's quite a mouthful of a title you got there, Oona. And president-elect of the American Society of International Law. It is wonderful to have so many jurists in the room tonight. And I say that without any irony whatsoever. And I just want to welcome among them our trustee, Hans-Michael Giessen, our senior counselor, who is perhaps better known for his diplomatic services than for his lawyering, Bernhard von der Planitz, Professor Dieter Grimm, who's here somewhere, formerly of the German Verfassungsgericht, the Constitutional Court, permanent fellow of our sister institution down the road in the Grunewald, the Wissenschaftskolleg. And I also want to welcome, and also a sometimes colleague at Yale of our speaker, and Anna Peters, director of the Max Planck Institute, who's right here. And the Max Planck Institute for Public and International Law. Now, I know that there are many more of you here and many other kinds of lawyers other than the international kind, but please don't sue me because I need to stop right there. Now, before introducing tonight's speaker, let me just say a word about the fellowship that makes this lecture possible. The Axel Springer Fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin was initiated in 2003, way back when, with the express aim of promoting German-American dialogue in the fields of media, policy, and all kinds of other areas of contemporary concern. And we are deeply grateful to Springer SA and its CEO, Matthias Döpfner, longtime Academy trustee, for their dedicated support over all these years. Previous Axel Springer fellows include political scientist Mark Koplovich, historians Holly Case and Mary Cerati, journalist and war crimes expert Deborah Amos, and most recently the longtime editor of Foreign Affairs Gideon Rose. And to this list, as of this semester, we add Oona Hathaway. So a complete introduction of our speaker this evening would take most of the evening. So let me just rattle off a few of Professor Hathaway's accomplishments, activities, and the like at Yale. In addition to her duties at the law school, she is professor of international law and area studies at Yale's Macmillan Center. She's a professor as well in the Department of Political Science, and she is the founding director of the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. As I mentioned before, and I'm mentioning it again because it's a really big deal, she was named president-elect of the American Society of International Law this year, which means that she will indeed be president of that renowned organization very soon. Next year? April. Wow. You have to come back. We'll have a party. Oona holds a BA, actually an AB in government from Harvard College, and a JD, her law degree from Yale. She clerked at the DC Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals for Judge Patricia Wald, one of the giants of our jurisprudence and a former Academy distinguished visitor here. And at the Supreme Court for another giant, and an even more renowned one, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Oona has been teaching at Yale since 2009, which means that we've had a whole array of different visitors of whom it was said, oh, he was my student. Previous assignments include Boston University School of Law, Harvard, University of Toronto, UC Berkeley, and Sciences Po. And since 2005, she has been a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the legal advisor of the State Department. That suggests you are still in that. You are. Fired me yet. Oh, do they have a legal advisor yet? They do. Oh, okay. Well, hooray for progress. And in 2014-15, she was a special counsel to the General Counsel for National Security Law at the Department of Defense, sometimes now referred to as the Department of War. She is a founding editor and executive editor of justsecurity.org, which is a must-read for anyone involved in the law and national security, and just about everything else these days. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And as if that weren't enough, she was named this year as a Guggenheim Fellow and elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So congratulations on all of that. Oona has published numerous articles in the top law journals and in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. She is co-author of the volume Foundations of International Law and Politics with our trustee and former Yale Law Dean Harold Koh. She also wrote together with her Yale colleague Scott Shapiro in 2017 the book The Internationalists: How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World, a book that was named one of the Economist's best books of 2017. And it's a really impressive book that does what your best university professor told you to do. Take a subject and the received wisdom and argue the opposite as hard as you can. And in this case, the authors discuss the much maligned Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928, also known as the Paris Peace Pact, which aimed to outlaw war. And rather than being the silliest thing ever cooked up by diplomats, they show how the treaty changed the world, creating a taboo on war making that had not existed before, planting the seeds for a human rights revolution after World War II, establishing economic sanctions as a tool of law enforcement, and setting the stage for the incredible growth of the international organizations that play such an important role in our lives today. So I am personally grateful that Oona wrote this book because it solved a big problem for me. I have been eager to learn more about that difficult and very important figure, Carl Schmitt. And my curiosity, so it's good to have props, had led me to this book, which is, I might add, unreadable. And it's this thick. And you contemplate one of these things and you say, is that really what I need in my life? Anyway, I mentioned this to Oona and she said, oh, just read the chapter on Schmitt in our book. You can see this book has gotten a lot more use than this. And she was absolutely right. It's a great chapter. I learned a hell of a lot. I no longer feel obliged to read this. My life is better. And so it's with a deep sense of gratitude that I now hand over the podium to you, Professor and President-elect Hathaway.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thanks so much to the staff who've made tonight possible, but also who take such good care of us and make this whole community possible. I'm so grateful to all of you for everything that you do. And thank you to my fellow fellows, most of whom are here. Really, the joy of this place has been the community that I've had a chance to be a part of, and it's really been a special time. And I'm already feeling sad that we're approaching halfway through, or maybe we're even past halfway through. But it's been really lovely, and I'm grateful for it. So today I'm talking about my project, Unbound, and I will say this is a project I started when I got here, and so it's still very early, but I wanted to share some of the ideas that I am playing with in the course of my time here, in hopes both that will be of interest to you, but also that hopefully I'll get some feedback that will be helpful to me as I continue to develop these ideas. So my plan today is to start with outlining the crisis that got me thinking about this project, that got me started, and the question that I'm asking in the project, really the question that I posed to myself that has been motivating this research. Then I want to say a little bit about how I've been going back to try and learn a bit from history to try and answer the question that I posed for myself. As Dan mentioned, the Internationalist kind of goes back in time. It goes back in history to try to answer the question of how do we get the global legal order that we have, and how did the nature of war change. And I'm doing something similar here, going back to try and see how people solve the problems that we're facing today and the past. Then I'll give you a very brief kind of introduction to where we are now in terms of the rules of modern international humanitarian law and the ways in which some of those rules have been unraveled, certainly challenged by the post 9/11 era, and the legal interpretations driven many by the United States, a lot of it driven by the United States and its interpretations of the law as part of its counterterrorism campaign. And then a bit about why this is such an important moment now to be thinking about these questions and my very initial thoughts about what we can do about this. There, I will say, I'm still very much struggling with that question. And if you all have answers, I'd be grateful for them. So that's the plan for today. All right, so first, the crisis. I don't think this will come as a huge surprise to you all. There's just been extraordinary violence occurring in the world the last several years. The war in Ukraine, not far from here, has led to the deaths of thousands of combatants, but also lots of civilians who've been caught in the middle of the conflict and who've died in the course of that war. Of course, Gaza and the conflict, you can't open the papers these days without reading about the horrors that are taking place there. The death count now over 60,000. And recent reports suggesting that at least the recent deaths have been primarily among civilians, not just combatants. We don't hear as much about the war in Sudan that's taking place, but that has been every bit as violent and terrible for civilians who've been caught in the middle of the violence, who've been killed in the course of the war, and who are facing starvation, which has been used as a weapon of war in the course of that conflict. So this is the kind of world that has led me to approach this project, to ask the question, if the goal of international humanitarian law, which is the law that governs the conduct of war, is to protect civilians from the worst violence of war, why are so many civilians suffering and dying in the course of war? It seems like a kind of maybe a naive question, a kind of simple question, but I think a kind of important question. If you're an international lawyer who believes that the law makes a difference in the world and wants to help it do a better job of achieving its ends, understanding why we have these failures, why, in fact, so many civilians are suffering in the course of war, and what, if anything, we can do about it seems important. So that's what's motivating the project. That's the kind of, in a way, kind of simple but extraordinarily difficult question that I'm trying to wrestle with. So as I often do in my work when I'm working on a hard problem and trying to think about how to answer it, I often go back to try and see how have people tried to solve these problems in the past, and how do we kind of get to where we are? Where did this received wisdom that we're dealing with today come from? How did these problems get solved in the past? And why did they make the compromises that they did that have led us to this kind of imperfect system that we have at the moment? And so I've been doing the same thing here that I often do in my work and go back into the past. And I'm starting here, at least in my initial research, in very much the same place that Scott and I started in the Internationalists, with Hugo Grotius, who also featured in the Internationalists. He's the father of international law, sort of a natural place to start in a sense, because he's widely recognized as a kind of critical figure in the creation of the field of international law. He wrote a book, The Law of War and Peace, which is still considered a foundational book in the field. And in the Internationalists, what Scott and I really emphasize is that people tend to think of him as a father of just war theory. So this idea that wars that are just can be fought, and states are entitled to engage in these wars. But what most people don't understand is what he meant by a just war. What he meant by a just war was a war that was waged for a just cause. For him, a just cause was basically any legal wrong, any claim that a state had against another for a wrong that had been done to them was entirely permissible for a state to go to war to right that wrong. Not only was this legal, it was almost in a sense obligatory. And so his view that we spoke more about in the course of the Internationalists was that states are legally entitled to use force to right wrongs. What we didn't spend as much time on in that book is, and we talked a little bit about it, but what I'm picking up on in this new project is his views about how the war could be waged. And again, he's thought of as this kind of great humanizer of war, but actually, when you read him, it's quite the opposite. He defends the idea that states, in pursuing their rights, can kill even women and children. He says how far this right to inflict injury extends may be perceived from the fact that the slaughter, even of infants and women, is made with impunity. In fact, he adopted very few limits on war. Really, the only limits were poisoning, killing by treachery, and rape. The first two really kind of comes out of thin air. He doesn't really justify it, which is sort of strange for Grotius because he likes to really ground his ideas. The main reason being that kings are worried about being poisoned and about being killed by treachery. And so they agree to these rules not to engage in poison and treachery because they're worried that that's how they're going to get killed. But they're not worrying so much about civilians or about their own population in the course of developing these rules. Now, not only was this something that Hugo Grotius was writing about, this is how people were waging war. They were doing pretty much everything that they needed to do in order to win the war. I've become, as my fellow fellows know, I've become a bit fascinated with Gustavus Adolphus, who was the king of Sweden, who joined the 30 Years' War. He was a key player in the 30 Years' War, which there was many, many players. He's particularly interesting because he is said to have slept with the Bible under his pillow, and next to it was Hugo Grotius's Law of War and Peace, or so they say. And he was, whether that was true or not, whether in fact it was under his pillow or not, he was apparently in his tent at the time he was killed a few years later. And so it's clear he was really paying attention to Grotius's work and thinking about what was permissible for him to do in war. His war manifesto that he issued when he started the war is a very Grotian war manifesto. It lays out all of the just reasons why he should be entitled to go to war. The interference with trade, the attacking of Swedish ships, the various kinds of wrongs that were being done that entitled him to go to war. And so clearly he was very much influenced by Hugo Grotius's work. He also is one of the first figures to try to issue a set of articles of war. So he issued these 167 articles that sort of laid out a set of rules that were meant to be actually read out loud to the soldiers. So each regiment was supposed to read these out loud once a month. And they entailed a bunch of rules that were supposed to regulate what they could do. What's instructive about it, there's a bunch of these, it's obviously very detailed, but a lot of these things are, you can't pillage unless you're commanded to. You can't kill civilians and women unless you're commanded to. You're not, so a lot of it was like, it's not that you can't ever do it, it's just you got to wait until you're told that it's okay. And then you can do these things that we would consider today to be really horrific. And a lot of that, I think, was he was trying to maintain and control over the use of violence, but it wasn't that he understood this violence to be impermissible. In the course of war, of course, millions of people died as a result of the conflict. And although Gustavus Adolphus tried to contain and manage the war through issuing these articles of war, even he found it extraordinarily difficult because at the time, you didn't have a centrally organized military. The way most of these militaries worked is that they basically picked up what we would today call mercenaries. They didn't really have the kind of concept of mercenaries. So picked up sort of forces along the way who essentially joined up in order to basically make money. And there were local commanders that would raise forces and join and agree to support one side or the other in the conflict. And there were Swedish forces on both sides, for instance, who were generally being paid pretty substantial amounts by either side and ended up sometimes fighting against one another. So it was a very decentralized form of organization of war. And in that context, it's just very hard to actually regulate war at all. Despite the fact that Gustavus tried, he often failed terribly. And there's lots of stories, grim and horrific stories that one can read and tell about the way that the war unfolded. But then there was this interesting transition that took place after the end of the 30 Years' War, where the 30 Years' War was mostly made up of these kind of largely mercenary forces and kind of decentralized, often armies that were made up of persons who didn't have the nationality of the commander of the king that was leading them. That something changes in the course of the mid 1600s to mid 1700s. And that important shift is the rise of the standing army. And I don't think I had really realized before I started reading this history how important that was to the ability to regulate war. You get an increasingly centralized state. You get bureaucracy, not very sexy or exciting, but it is the sort of thing that makes it possible to regulate violence in a different way. You get the rise of conscription. You have militaries that are made up of citizen soldiers, rather than these mercenaries who are kind of multinational mercenary groups that are sort of just there to make money and who are often being paid through pillage and through what they can take from the peasants around them. In this case, they're actually being paid a wage. They have uniforms. They are being provisioned by the military. And so the ability to actually raise an army, often very large armies, and to control the violence that they bring with them is really transformed over the course of this period. And so the ability to actually begin to think about putting real limits on violence becomes a reality. And in fact, you see this reflected in what we would call customary international law. So that is the views about both what states are permitted to do, the opinio juris, the law as it's accepted by states, and then what they actually do. This is just one writer, Vattel, who's well known among international lawyers. And what his writing, I think, reflects is when you've got this creation of someone who's this kind of military class, the standing army, the standing military, you create the possibility of the opposite. That is the possibility that there's something that might be called a civilian, which they weren't called a civilian in the 1700s just yet. That word didn't really come into common usage until around World War I. But this idea that there's a class of people who are not part of the war and who should be insulated from the violence really first emerges alongside the creation of a standing military. This idea that there are people, yes, they're part of the enemy, they're citizens of the enemy, and so they are enemies, they're private enemies, but violence against them isn't permissible because it's not necessary, they're not taking up arms, and we should be leaving them alone, we shouldn't be subjecting them to violence. Very different from what we saw from Hugo Grotius in the early 1600s, where he's saying it's fine to go ahead and slaughter civilians if you like. By the 1700s, that has now become understood to be not acceptable anymore. And I think that is because of the idea of what I'm trying to call this idea of inventing the civilian, inventing the idea that there is someone who is not subject to the violence of war. We see around this time, alongside the emergence of standing armies, a kind of greater recognition over time of the way in which war is affecting soldiers as well as civilians, and the beginnings in the mid-1800s of regulation of war. So this picture was apparently taken on the eve of the Battle of Solferino, which is a battle that took place between over 140,000 Franco-Sardinian troops who clashed with about the same number of Austrian troops on a literal battlefield. So a field that's sort of pretty far away from kind of a settlement or a town or a city. This is an encampment. You can see it's reasonably well organized. These are kind of lined up tents that kind of all look the same, sort of suggests a kind of central provisioning of the military and a kind of organization to the military that certainly wasn't true during the course of the 30 Years' War, but now by the mid-1800s has become the norm. Henry Dunant wrote this book, A Memory of Solferino. If you're an international lawyer, you've heard of this. Otherwise, you probably haven't. It made quite a splash because it was a document where he relates in exciting detail the battle, which apparently he didn't actually see, as he admitted later. But then he also talks about the horrors of the aftermath, which people hadn't up until that point really written much about. And in real excruciating detail. It's pretty terrible reading. And that was published. It was published all around Europe, and people read this and were horrified by what they were hearing about young men being left to die on the battlefield and screaming out in pain and nobody coming to their aid and no kind of assistance being offered to them. And it really galvanized the public, and it galvanized an idea that maybe we should try to do something about this. Maybe we should do something to try and regulate the violence of war, at least some of the horrific effects of it. And that creates a possibility for the very first international treaty, the Geneva Convention of 1864. So very first multilateral treaty that's attempting to regulate war. And here it's really focused on the treatment of wounded soldiers. So it's not so much focused on civilians. The main discussion of civilians so that if civilians help the other side's wounded, don't kill them for doing it. That's okay. But it also suggests that sovereigns care to some degree about their soldiers in a way that at a time when it was made a bunch of mercenaries that weren't citizen soldiers, you didn't really care all that much. But now that these guys are citizens, they have families back at home, they're part of your population. When they're done fighting, they're going to come back home and live in your country. You actually have to deal with the aftermath of the harm that's being done to them in the course of the violence. And you might actually begin to care a little bit about what happens to them. And you might be willing to accept certain kinds of legal obligations that come with that. So this is the very kind of beginnings of an effort to try and regulate war through law. The next big step is the 1874 Brussels Declaration. Fyodor Fyodorovich Martins is a young lawyer, 23-year-old Russian international lawyer who was tasked by the Tsar with leading this conference. So it's a big task for a young international lawyer. The Russians had called this conference. It's not entirely clear why. It may be partially because they actually cared about the well-being of citizens and people might be harmed in war. It also seems pretty clear that over the course of this period, and they're very active leaders in conversations about regulating war in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that at least some of the motivation is that there's a rapid development of technology happening during this period, particularly gun technology. And the Russians just can't keep up. And so at least part of what's motivating them is an effort to try and limit the development of these weapons, perhaps, though they're not very successful at that. They don't actually get anybody to agree to disarmament or to limiting the weapons. But they do make some progress in regulating war for the first time, particularly use of violence against civilians. So the 1874 Brussels Declaration adopts a few of these ideas, and this is just some of them. But this idea that you don't have unlimited power to inflict violence on the enemy. It sounds like a kind of obvious idea today, but it was in a sense a kind of novel thought that you can't just do whatever you want against the other side. They developed this idea of fortified or defended towns versus open towns, and the way in which they decide to protect civilians is to say, if it's an open town, that is, it's undefended, you can't go and just destroy it. You got to leave it alone. If it's fortified, it's defended, you can do whatever you need to do to take it. You can kill the civilians, you can bombard it, you can destroy it, that's okay. But if it's open and it's undefended, you can't. Now that, again, seems like kind of a small victory for civilians. But at the time, given that there hadn't really been any kind of clear rules about how to make real protections for civilians, this was a step in the right direction. And then they even had an idea that certain kinds of public buildings should be protected, hospitals should be protected, cultural sites, art, etc. And it expressly prohibits pillage, which is, again, a big step, particularly given that for hundreds of years, the main way in which soldiers had been paid was through pillage. And now we're sort of giving up that right to engage in pillage and not inflicting that kind of pain on civilians, which is a critical advance, not only because when pillage happens, all kinds of violence happens against civilians, but also most people are living kind of just day to day. And when the food that you've saved up is taken from you and you're a peasant, that basically means starvation. And in the 30 Years' War, much of the civilian death was as a result of starvation because the food that they needed to survive was being taken from them by these soldiers. So it's not just the kind of immediate violence, but the long-term effects that violence can have. So this is, again, an effort to try and begin to humanize war. Martins considered this a total failure. And the reason he considered it a total failure is that they came up with these great sets of rules, everybody signed it, they went home, and then nobody ratified it, nobody adopted it as binding, nobody agreed to actually follow these rules. It kind of sat on a shelf. And so in a sense, it was a failure. But in another sense, it was a great success because the ideas that it embodied really was a kind of novel idea that we're going to try and temper violence against civilians through law. And those rules become binding law about a quarter century later in the Hague Conventions that take place in 1899 and 1907, where these rules become binding international law, along with a lot of other rules that kind of try to elaborate on these obligations that states will hold. And this is a picture, apparently, from the Second Hague Conference in 1907. So these ideas begin to take hold. States actually agree to them. They agree to these binding obligations. They sign these treaties. They have a set of kind of agreed principles that they're going to abide by. And then the airplane comes along. And it really upsets the whole thing. It turns out the airplane just upends much of the rules that they just agreed to. So there's this Giulio Gavotti, who's an Irish soldier. He is a young man who is fighting for the Irish, for the Italians, against what in modern day Libya, against the Ottoman forces. And he's ordered to do the first aerial bombardment. And he writes this letter home to his father where he very excitedly describes the day. And he had this little box of effectively grenades sitting next to him in this open plane. This one is just a picture of him, so that's useful, but it's a fixed wing plane of the kind that's in the right-hand side. Not a great picture, but it gives you a little bit of an idea. The top's totally open. So he's flying along. He's flying. It's just him by himself. He's flying it along. He has this little box of grenades next to him. He has to take them out. He has to pull the pin out. He has to hold it so that it doesn't explode in front of him. And he has to throw it out the plane, which he does. And he throws out several of these. And he manages to drop it on several Ottoman encampments. And he's very excited that this is the first aerial bombardment. It's celebrated all over Europe. The newspapers are very excited about this. I was curious how the Ottomans reacted to it, and worked with a researcher to try and get some of the local reaction. And they protested that apparently at least one of these bombs fell on a hospital. So a harbinger of things to come, unfortunately. Now, this upends everything that they had just agreed to, because this whole idea of defended versus undefended cities now really makes no sense. Because if you have airplanes, what does it mean to defend from airplanes? The fortifications don't really make any difference with an airplane. And if there are other airplanes that can fight against your airplanes, does that make there anything within kind of the flying distance of your Air Force suddenly defended? So they realize those rules are really not going to work very well anymore. It also means that the battlefield now extends well into the countryside in a way that hadn't been true. You don't have these kind of single battlefields where everybody's sort of sitting out there waiting to clash together. You end up having fighting now moving kind of everywhere, potentially, and extending throughout the country. And it has all kinds of follow-on effects. They try to deal with this in 1923 with what they call the Hague Rules on Aerial Warfare, and they abandon this idea of a difference between defended and undefended. They come up with this idea of military objectives. Any military lawyers in the room will recognize this term. This is still the term that we use today when we're trying to decide whether a bombing is lawful. The first question you ask is, are you attempting to use force against a military objective? That's the first question. That's still the actual terminology that we use today. They also invent this idea of collateral damage, also the idea that we use today. Sometimes we call it the law of proportionality, or the prohibition, the principle of proportionality. And this is how they define this idea of proportionality. What's interesting is they say, look, you can use violence against civilians, but only if it's sufficiently important. And what I find interesting about that is it's kind of the first time that they accept the idea that there might be a use of violence that could be useful, but that might still not be lawful because it's the thing you're trying to get is not sufficiently important to justify the harm to civilians. So this is a really important, I think, innovation in war. Again, it's kind of a failure because nobody signs on to it. But again, the ideas become the foundational principles. All these ideas are in our law today, like exactly these terms, exactly these concepts. They invent them in 1923. They're not immediately adopted, but they are adopted later in the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, and are the law that when I was working at the Pentagon as a lawyer that I was applying was exactly this. So what are those laws today? I'm just going to say very, very briefly some of the key principles. So the received principles, so there's a lot still to go. I'm not going to subject you to all the various like additional developments. There's more. There's a lot more that we could talk about. But the key principles, the key kind of underlying fundamental principles of international humanitarian law are these three principles. Principle of distinction, you have to distinguish between military objectives and civilians and civilian objects. This principle of proportionality, that if you're going to seek to use violence against a military objective, you have to ensure that the attack doesn't lead to excessive civilian casualties. Right? So it prohibits use of force that can be expected to cause excessive civilian damage in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage achieved. That's the language from the Additional Protocol 1. And then this additional principle that when in doubt, essentially take all feasible precautions to protect civilians. These are kind of the core underlying ideas that motivate international lawyers who are assessing whether a particular use of force is lawful or not. There's obviously lots of detail to it, but these are the kind of key ideas. But then 9/11, I think, has really played a role in the unraveling of this settlement, of this set of principles, of these limitations. Let me say just a little bit about why I think that's true. So obviously, we're all aware the kind of horrors of 9/11, nearly 3,000 civilians killed in a set of terrorist attacks. When I worked at the Pentagon, I walked past a memorial to the people who were killed at the Pentagon because it was one of the sites at which an attack took place. And there's a big memorial quilt at the entrance that I walked past every time I came into work. So it's very much a kind of present memory for people who are working in the Pentagon on a daily basis. But what it led to was a massive counterterrorism campaign that still is going on today. And this map from Brown University just shows all the places where this is not all bombing, this is where the counterterrorism campaigns take place. A lot of it is training exercises, but some of it is use of drones. Those red marks are where there's use of drones for actual targeting in 2021 to 2023. So this is a massive counterterrorism campaign that the U.S. has engaged in, and a massive apparatus that has been created over the course of the last 2 decades and more. And you can see this from the rise in what we call internationalized interstate wars. These are basically civil wars where there's an outside state involved. This is not just the U.S., but these are states that are involved in civil wars. These are European states and the United States primarily that are involved in wars that are taking place, many of them in Africa and the Middle East. So you see this internationalization of civil wars that take place after 9/11. And to go along with this is a effort to interpret international humanitarian law in a way that gives lawyers and their clients more flexibility to go after the folks they consider to be the bad guys. And one of the ways in which that's happening, there's a lot of ways in which it's happening, but just one is how they interpret this idea of civilians directly participating in hostilities. So civilians are supposed to be insulated from war, but if they directly participate in hostilities, those limits don't apply to them. So if you pick up arms and you start shooting at us, we can shoot back. That's the kind of basic idea. But the U.S. has played a role in really expanding the idea of who counts as a kind of civilian you can use violence against, that you can target with drones or with retaliatory use of military force, and also who you can detain. And so you see on the left here, this is the ICRC's, International Committee on the Red Cross, and states that follow the ICRC's interpretation. It's a kind of narrower view about who counts. So if you engage in combat with enemy forces, obviously you're a civilian directly participating in hostilities. If you operate anti-aircraft weapons, obviously you're a civilian directly participating in hostilities. If you do real-time spotting of artillery fire, it's generally accepted also that you count. And if you provide coordinates for immediate strikes, you're a civilian directly participating in hostilities. So this is a group of people who are within one causal step of the violence of the actual combat. What's more contested is the U.S. has pushed a kind of further set. That is, weapons repairs can count, transporting fighters can count, military recruitment can count, intelligence gathering near operations can count. So it's a step removed further than this on the left-hand side. And it sweeps in a lot more civilians into the kind of targetable and detainable group under this interpretation of civilians who directly participate in hostilities. Another way in which this happens is whether you go in and out of status as a targetable actor. So the narrow approach, which some derogatively refer to as the revolving door approach, is that you're targetable when you're engaging in the actions, but in between you're not. You're protected. You go back to your civilian life. You're not participating in the war effort. We don't know if you're ever going to participate in it again. We're going to treat you as a civilian again. You've kind of gone back to your civilian status. Whereas the broad approach, which is an approach the U.S. has adopted, and many of its other states that it's in conversation with, the United Kingdom, France, Israel, adopt this position as well, which is essentially what we think is a pattern begins, you're continuously targetable. Even if in between you're not actually engaging in any of these military operations, you're still targetable. What's tricky about this is there's also an inference that once you start doing certain kinds of conduct, we can expect you're going to continue to do it. So we can treat you as continuously targetable, even if you're not currently engaged in it. And so this makes it very hard to disengage. The only way to disengage is to engage in affirmative disengagement. Exactly what counts is not entirely clear. How do you let the drones know that you've affirmatively disengaged? Really not so easy, it turns out. And so, once you're in, it's very hard to ever get out under this interpretation. So there's a lot of ways in which this is just a couple of examples to give you an idea of how this kind of expansive interpretation of the rules has really expanded the set of civilians that are within the kind of zone of people who can potentially be targeted. And this has real consequences. And I've written this article, Crowdsourced War, that I'm drawing on in the book, written with a couple of students of mine. And this is an example that we use there. This is an app. You can download it on your phone right now if you wish, though you have to read Ukrainian, which I don't, unfortunately. It's called the EPPO app, and you can use it to upload photos of military, of Russian forces. So, this is particularly true in areas where there's Russian occupying forces. You take a photo of Russian occupying forces or of their equipment or artillery or operations, and you upload it on this app. And that goes straight to the Ukrainian military, which then can use it for targeting. Sometimes because it has GPS coordinates on it, they sometimes will target immediately the forces that are identified through the app. Now, under the U.S. interpretation of civilians directly participating in hostilities, probably just having this app may by itself be enough to make you a civilian directly participating in hostilities, or at least creates the possibility that you might be. Certainly, once you have uploaded a photo, you are a participant, and we can assume that you might be a repeat participant. So you're you're now continuously targetable as a result. Also in Ukraine has invited people to join the IT army. You don't have to actually be a cyber expert to join the IT army. You just have to have a computer. And you basically sign up. You can go onto this website, and I translated it from the Ukrainian using handy Google Translate. And you basically just sign up to let your computer be used for DDoS attacks and other kinds of cyber attacks. Again, this is the sort of thing that potentially makes you targetable. Now, there's no warnings here that tell you that that's the case. You might be a civilian directly participating in hostilities for joining these cyber operations against Russian forces. But that's the truth of the matter, that the U.S. interpretation, which is shared by many of our allies, would suggest that you might be. On Blue Sky, there's a bunch of these Ukrainian fundraisers who are raising funds. If you're on Blue Sky, which is the left of center Twitter, so it's the sort of left alternative to Twitter. There's a bunch of these folks who are on raising money for equipment for Ukrainian forces. From the very beginning of the war, there was all this kinds of crowdfunding for the Ukrainian forces, because many of them just didn't have adequate equipment to enable the defense. People just needed basic equipment, uniforms. There weren't enough uniforms. They didn't have enough basic protective gear. But again, you're paying for military gear. You're paying for participating, for enabling the military effort. And the U.S. has treated fundraising as enough to make you a civilian directly participating in hostilities. Even Elon Musk might potentially be a civilian directly participating in hostilities. You all probably know that that Starlink has been a key factor in the war, providing internet throughout Ukraine and enabling military forces to operate their drones. And Elon Musk has made personal decisions about where to enable the forces. He famously turned off the internet to disable the use of drones in Crimea, has threatened at various points to turn off the internet and disable Ukrainian forces from engaging in their defense. But the fact that he can turn it off means that he's also made the decision to turn it on, and maybe personally responsible for enabling use of force. And there's a decent argument that makes him a direct participant in hostilities. Another area where we're seeing a kind of an erosion of this distinction between civilians and combatants is in the rise of this idea called dual-use objects. So these are objects that are military objectives, legally speaking, but they're heavily used by civilians, and damage to these objects has extraordinary negative impacts on civilians. The United States has played a really critical role in the increasingly expansive targeting of dual-use objects. It's not the only one that does it, but because the U.S. Is such a major player in use of military force abroad, it's where we see this happening most prominently. And I'm going to give you a few examples. So one example is targeting of transportation infrastructure, which is increasingly being regarded as a dual-use object. This is a civilian casualty report that my co-author, Azmat Khan, who's a reporter for the New York Times, who did the series Civilian Casualty Files, she FOIA'd the U.S. Department of Defense, that's filing a Freedom of Information Act request to U.S. Department of Defense, and sued them to get all these civilian casualty reports. And we went through a bunch of these reports and found all the instances where dual-use objects were being mentioned. And this is one of a bridge strike in Mosul. The U.S. basically took out all of the bridges in Mosul. There were five of them. Now, of course, disabling the bridges makes sense if you're fighting a war. It makes it harder for militants to move forces around, but it also really cripples civilian life, makes it difficult for people to get access to food, water, basic necessities, get to work, see their families. And it's really had an extraordinary impact on the lives of civilians in Mosul. Russians, of course, have targeted transportation. We saw from the very beginning of the war some of those heartrending pictures of train stations being targeted and children dying in the course of those strikes. So this has become, an important part of the Ukrainian war. Electrical infrastructure as well. The U.S. Criticized Russia for its strikes on the Ukrainian electrical grid and suggested maybe it's a war crime. But The U.S. has also done plenty of targeting of electrical facilities, and in fact, its Department of Defense Law of War manual says that it thinks that these are lawful targets. This is the Air Wars is an NGO that sort of tracks civilian casualties, allegations of civilian casualties, and found that there was a case where an electrical generating facility had been targeted by the U.S., leading to 22 civilians being injured in the course of that strike. Schools have been targeted. Ukraine, of course, again, famously, lots of schools have been targeted and destroyed in the course of the conflict. And in Gaza, schools have been a major target. Now, they're dual-use objects because the claim, at least, is that these buildings are being used by militants, but they are also often schools. Both things can be true. And the impact is that children don't have access to school. These basic necessities are not being met. And hospitals, same thing is true. Hospitals have been destroyed at a rapid rate in Gaza. This was a brink of collapse in January. I think it'd probably be fair to say that the health sector is really not able to serve the people of Gaza at this point. And the result is that protections for civilians of war have just been eroded to the point that they threaten to lose all meaning. So this idea that there are civilians that are insulated from violence has really been eroded by these various ways in which we've developed a set of rules that allow us to target the very things that civilians rely on. Okay, so why now? Why should we be worrying about this now? These problems have existed for a long time. Why is this particularly urgent at this moment? At least one reason is I think we might be on the cusp of a transformation in the global legal order, where we may be seeing a lot more violence coming forward. This is a piece that I wrote with Scott, my co-author on the Internationalists, where we argue that we may be on the cusp of a breakdown in the prohibition on use of force that has, while been imperfect since the adoption of the UN Charter, has nonetheless brought us unprecedented peace and reduced interstate war pretty substantially in the 80 years since the UN has been in place. But we might be at the beginning of an erosion of that set of principles. We're seeing that in Ukraine. We're seeing that with the US president threatening to make Canada the 51st state, for instance. We're seeing it with China's moves in the South China Sea. And there are a lot of indications that this role may be eroding. If that's true, then we might be on the cusp of seeing more wars, and all of us might be more vulnerable as a result. What can we do? This is where I have to say my thinking is still very early, and I feel like the answers are kind of inadequate to the problem, I'll be honest. And so if you'll have any brilliant ideas, I'm looking for them. But let me say a few thoughts. I mean, first, no rules are going to ever perfectly protect civilians in war. And so the only real protection is to limit war. And I think, fighting and trying to address this erosion, the prohibition on war is kind of the first order goal, and trying to do something about maintaining and sustaining that prohibition has got to be, job number one. But I think there's also much that we can do to try and reverse some of the erosion that's taken place in the course of the last 20 years and sometimes more of interpretation of the rules that we have under international humanitarian law in ways that make civilians more vulnerable. These are just a few. I've written a lot of law review articles that try to make other arguments about what we can do. And some of that I'll be recounting in the book, although hard to make it really sexy and exciting. So I'm trying to think about how to make it more interesting. But among other things is pushing back against the U.S. Interpretation of this broad interpretation of who's targetable. And part of the reason I wrote the Crowdsourced War article was to try and speak to U.S. lawyers to say, look, these rules that we adopted to try and fight the war on terror, as it was once called, are now creating vulnerabilities for all of us. And it's time for us to rethink whether we made the right choices about how to interpret the law and maybe not be quite so resistant to the ICRC's more narrow interpretation of what is permissible. I think states should consider what are sometimes called reverberating effects and cumulative effects when targeting dual-use objects. So reverberating effects is not just, how many civilians are sitting on the bridge, but what does it do to a community to destroy all the bridges? What kind of impact does that have on the civilian life and ability of people to feed themselves and basic economic support of the community? Cumulative effects, that means destroying the first hospital is terrible. Destroying the last hospital is totally catastrophic. And so being aware of the impact over time that this can have. And thinking about how to address accountability, provide accountability for civilian deaths. There is this idea that collateral damage is permissible and you can kill civilians knowingly when you're seeking to achieve military objectives. But I think we should think really long and hard about whether there ought to nonetheless be obligations to compensate civilians for harm in those cases. And that compensation requirement could help make clearer what the actual costs are of war, because right now it's kind of swept under the carpet. We don't necessarily know exactly what the impact is. And I think states should be holding one another to account. It's not just that we should be holding our own states to account in democracies, but also states should hold one another to account. And international law is really built on the idea that states will hold one another to account. Just a few words about Germany. Germany has done a little bit of this. You all probably know about the arms embargo against Israel, motivated in part, and Germany's not the only one, by concerns that the arms might be used in violation of international humanitarian law. Whatever one thinks of the merits of that decision, this is this kind of move to try and limit the use of arms or providing arms if you're concerned that they might be used in violation of international law. It is the kind of thing that states need to adopt if these rules are going to be effective. It's also the case that Germany is on the cusp of building what will be the fourth largest army in the world. Germany has not really been part of these conversations to date about what the rules ought to be. They've not been at the table in these West Point meetings, and they've not been shaping the conversation among the states that have been adopting these broad interpretations in the course of counterterrorism campaigns. And I worry a little bit that Germany might be tempted to adopt kind of the US position because it's well developed and it's well accepted by the UK and France. I think that would be a big mistake. And I think in the course of building the military, building a set of robust legal protections that are distinctive to Germany and where Germany's thinking carefully about what rules ought to govern its use of force going forward would be a really important step, not only towards ensuring that when you're using force, you're doing so in the most responsible way possible, but also could have an impact on what the conversation looks like globally. So with that, I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much. So, it's often the case we have these talks and we say, I can't imagine a more important subject. And then you go to the next talk and you say, wow, I can't imagine a more important subject. So thank you for that. It was completely fascinating. And as someone who was sort of in the middle of the war on terror, I'm fascinated and troubled. There's no question that the war on terror went wrong in innumerable ways. Wound up killing about 600,000 people at last count. But I want to just ask you to defend the implicit entailment here. Okay, the argument seems to me to be that the U.S. blurred a lot of lines. Who is a targetable civilian, dual use, civilian infrastructure, things like that. And that this has led to a broader erosion of norms. If I look at the world in my innocent way and just say, I look at the Congo and I look at I look at Ukraine and I look at Gaza, I'm asking myself, were they really influenced by what we did in the war on terror in these various conflicts? Or are there other things at work here, like the receding of the horrors of the world wars, the diminution of deterrence, which made Eurasia incredibly safe for 70 years, because there were nuclear weapons and no one was going to break the rules. I guess I wonder if we had been much more scrupulous and not made as many mistakes in the war on terror, would Vladimir Putin be any more scrupulous about the way he's conducting the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question, and there are lots of reasons for violence against civilians. This is not the only one, obviously. But look, the U.S. is a major player in using force itself, as you said. Somewhere around 400 to 600,000 civilians killed. That's a lot of people. And the U.S. has major influence on what everybody else does, both because we're the major arms exporter, and we therefore can determine, who we're willing to sell arms to. And because we engage in massive training exercises, support, education of forces around the world. You saw that map. Much of Africa has received training from the U.S., arms from the U.S., has learned how to engage in fighting with non-state actor groups from the United States, has adopted the way in which we do things. And so, I'm an American, so I start at home in trying to solve the problem. And I think that there is a lot of responsibility that the U.S. has. Now, is it the case that Putin, would have waged the war differently if we hadn't done this? That's very hard to say. I will say that it rings pretty hollow for the U.S. to criticize attacks on electrical grid when the U.S. destroyed all of Iraq's electrical grid. And much of the targeting that was happening in Iraq was the oil industry was heavily targeted. Oil refinement was heavily targeted. Transportation of oil was heavily targeted. Production of oil was heavily targeted. When we did the looked through these civilian casualty reports, a lot of the targeting was oil industry targeting and electrical facility targeting. And so it's very hard for the U.S. to turn around and say, like, Vladimir Putin, you really can't do that. That's a war crime. When we've been doing it in our own DoD law of war manual says it's fine. So it does disable us in holding others to account when we're violating those rules ourselves. So yeah, I think it does matter. Would all civilian deaths in war end if we, hadn't adopted these broad interpretations of the limits of international humanitarian law? Definitely not, right? War is brutal and bloody and violent, and containing it is just extraordinarily hard. But it is, these rules do make a difference, and we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, no, Mike, I certainly agree with you on the importance of cleaning up our own act and the importance of precedent, and that the world does look at us. I'm just trying to, add up all the different vectors and figure out what is it that is making this the kind of global crisis that it is. The issue about targeting energy infrastructure is a really interesting one, because I think I'm not the only person in the room or anywhere who wakes up every morning and saying, yeah, the Ukrainians hit another Russian refinery. It's a complicated issue, and I'm not always 100% sure where the line should be drawn.
Yeah, it's hard, right? Look, the Biden administration clearly restrained the Ukrainians from doing that. They made the judgment that it was escalatory. And, so were they wrong? I don't know. But it does seem to be provoking more escalatory attacks back. They're hitting Kyiv, they're hitting the electrical grid even harder than they were before. We've been seeing an uptick in civilian deaths in recent months. And so, it's not clear that this is making things better in that conflict. And it does deprive Ukraine of the argument that hitting electrical systems is unlawful. And in fact, there is a International Criminal Court indictment against Russian generals for, among other things, targeting the electrical grid. I don't know, it might be undermined a bit by the fact that Ukraine is attacking oil refineries. I haven't tracked it closely enough to tell, there's obviously a difference between, there's traditionally been a difference between fuel that's directly going to support the military forces versus fuel that's being used for civilians. And I haven't sat down to do the math to see, to what extent the Ukrainians have been attentive to that distinction. But from what I've been reading, it doesn't seem that they have been terribly attentive to that distinction. And so suggests they've decided to kind of take the gloves off. And I know there's many people who cheer that, but where does that end? Where does that go? I don't think that ends well for anybody, is my guess.
So one of the issues that you alluded to, but maybe didn't have time to dig into, was the extent to which the problems we confront are the result of what might be called the democratization of violence, and the fact that you have violence, political violence being committed now by individuals, small groups, large groups, rebel insurgent groups, all of which are not wearing uniforms, or most of which are not wearing uniforms. We know that the story of the post-war period, at least until 10-15 years ago, not even, was about civil wars and about the rise of terrorism. Of course, the fear we had after 9/11 was that now you could have non-state actors who were super empowered and could cause the kinds of destruction that states had previously been capable of doing solely. That now seems not to be true yet, although I think that because of the accelerating technology of violence and the accessibility of that technology, it is a huge problem. But the point is, the lines are blurring everywhere, and that is really hard to control for.
Yeah, it is. It is, and that's part of what makes this so challenging. Although, again, this is where looking back in the past is somewhat helpful, because these are not new problems. This is, when we look back into the past, we see that actually the regulation of the military and the containment of violence in a state apparatus was a kind of recent invention, in the sort of early 1700s, this idea that this was going to be contained within states, and that the state was going to be regulating the violence and maintaining it and managing it and bureaucratically organizing it. Before that, it wasn't very contained. And even once they started trying to contain it through these standing armies, they were constantly being frustrated by the fact that the terrors, emerged in the Franco-Prussian War, and the Germans really upset that the French civilians are taking up arms and shooting at them from, inside their homes. And they think it's like a terrible travesty, and they're really upset about it. And so, these are not new problems. This is an old problem. And, this is where, again, I'm interested in trying to think about, how have we tried to deal with these problems in the past? And what they tried to do was to say, look, there were definitely disagreements. Some wanted to say, these guys are all criminals and we should just hang them all. And there were others who said, look, as long as they're going to follow the rules too, then we should give them some basic rights. And that judgment somewhat held. So under Common Article 3, non-state actor groups both get basic rights of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and they're bound by those obligations under Common Article 3. And the International Committee on the Red Cross, in fact, sends groups to educate non-state actor groups about what their legal obligations are under international humanitarian law. And they have, they actually have a dialogue around these rules about how to properly treat prisoners and et cetera. And it makes a difference, So I think, yes, violence is hard to contain. We have, these weapons. I mean, in the United States, like anybody can get a military grade weapon, and that's incredibly scary. But we can find ways, we can try to regulate that violence through various kinds of rules, and they make some difference. Does it solve all the problems? Does it address all of it? Obviously not. But the goal is not to solve all the problems, but to try and make the world a little bit better.
It's for me personally depressing because during the Obama administration, we actually conditioned a lot of our anti-terrorism assistance to others on fulfilling all their obligations under what's known as the Leahy regulations, which required that groups with human rights violations couldn't be trained. And we accompanied all kinds of rule of law training. We trained judges, prosecutors, so on and so forth. And it did make a difference. There were countries like Indonesia that went from practicing counterterrorism with a chainsaw to doing it with a scalpel, and these things did improve. But the sad thing is that there is less and less of a consensus in the United States for this kind of effort. And what really worries me, and I was surprised you didn't bring it up, was when we now have a Secretary of Defense who, just derides the Geneva Conventions as though, they were the Marquis of Queensberry's rules for playing cricket.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have an explanation for how it is we could be in a place, and Trump is saying this too, or no more Mr. Nice Guy going to war. We want to maximize lethality, all the rest. I understand we want to win our wars when we fight them, but how did we get to a place where the smart use of power has been eclipsed by a desire to have maximum brutality in a country that was the standard bearer for international law for all
it's
years.
Super depressing. It's super depressing. I've a lot of my work has been written with an imagined audience of thoughtful people in the U.S. government. I don't write that way anymore. I now don't feel like I have that audience in the same way. I hope I'll have it again someday. But, the U.S. was making good steps. I will say the Leahy law is an important law. So for those who are not familiar with it, basically says that U.S. doesn't provide military assistance to state forces that have a record of human rights abuses. It's been a really important advance in terms of limiting U.S. support and assistance to state armed forces that were engaging in horrific human rights abuses against their own citizens. And I think it's generally regarded as a real success. There's two problems with it. One is that it's about human rights, not international humanitarian law. So it leaves out international humanitarian law obligations. And the other problem is that it only applies to state forces, not non-state forces. And the U.S. does a lot of partnering with non-state forces, and those are not covered by Leahy. So those are gaps that I've argued for filling. Under this administration, we're not likely to fill them. And the U.S. also was developing a very advanced program on addressing civilian casualties. They under the previous administration, they'd hired, I think, about 180 people whose full-time job in the Pentagon was to try to think about how to reduce civilian casualties. Thought that was a good thing. They were thinking about how to rationalize our compensation scheme for civilian casualties. I thought that was a really good thing. They actually cared about trying to make this problem better. They were at least open to having conversations about whether we should be incorporating reverberating effects into our analysis. You could have those kinds of conversations. You had an audience for that. You had people who are willing to engage. They maybe didn't start on the same page. but they were open to the conversation. And, I worked in the Pentagon, and there were people who were there who were open to that conversation. There are still some of those folks there, I will say. I have former students who work there who care about these issues. But certainly the messaging from the top is, we don't care at all about this anymore. And it's really a tragedy because, for all the obvious reasons, but it's not just a tragedy because of what it means about what the U.S. is prepared to do. But because the U.S. has so much leverage to change what others do. It is the one way you could change things overnight, is to get the U.S. to basically do Leahy-like conditioning of support for IHL compliance and have international humanitarian law principles of the kind that I've talked about embedded in that conditioned provision of assistance. If you did that, you'd see just a kind of transformation overnight. The U.S. just has unparalleled capacity to change what states do, because it provides arms and provides support and training. And I'm sad that we don't have that. But the fact that we don't have that now doesn't mean that we won't have it in 4 years. And the fact that we don't have it now doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and just assume the problem is, not worth trying to solve, right? I mean, there are other states who have the capacity. Germany's decision not to sell arms is an example of that. This is, I think, for states to not just wait around. If anything good comes of this moment, it is this idea that, a lot of states have relied on the United States to solve these kinds of problems. And I think a recognition the U.S. is not going to be the leader and might not even be a follower is important, because I think you have to realize that if this is going to be solved, you're going to have to solve it yourself. And so, hopefully it will galvanize people to be thinking, not just waiting for the U.S. to come up with a solution, but trying to think of the solutions themselves.
So we have very little time and have to get to the audience. So your questions need to be extraordinarily concise and with a very clear question mark at the end. Teacher Grimm.
Do I need a microphone?
Yes, it's coming. Please wait for the microphone.
Very brief. Do you think that there is a role for courts to enforce these rules? And I'm thinking more of national courts now than of international courts. I mean, the advantage could at least be that the content of the rules is not defined by the interested actors, but by the independent agency.
Yeah, I do. In the US, it's hard to get this into court, but I know this has been true in some countries where these issues have come into court. The Dutch, for instance, where it was a Dutch court that determined that the F-35 parts, I think it was F-35 parts, couldn't be sold to Israel because of concerns about that they would be used in international humanitarian law violations. I'd like it if we had rules that were more judicially enforceable. In the US, we have this is a whole other set of problems that foreign relations, foreign assistance issues often are hard to get into court for standing reasons. But I think in other places, having a set of clear principles that can be, as you say, objectively applied is really important. And in fact, one of the reasons we've run into the problems that we have in international humanitarian law in the US, at least, is that a lot of these rules are interpreted by executive branch lawyers without any real oversight. And what was most striking to me about my time in the Pentagon was, we're coming up with these interpretations of the law, and there's no one who is sort of second guessing us. And you're constantly wishing that there would be somebody who would actually tell us we've got this wrong, because there's no incentive to constrain your interpretation of what you can do under those circumstances. So yeah, I'd like to, and I've written elsewhere about trying to find ways to get courts more involved. I do think that can play a really important role, because for executive branch lawyers who are advising their clients, very hard to say no. Very hard to say no. And so you need some kind of external constraint, and the courts can be a really important external constraint.
Professor Peters.
in the last years I had perverse conversations about who's worse, Israel or Russia. So do you think that the firewall between use ad bellum and use in bello, meaning that in the rules of international humanitarian law must be respected regardless of whether you are a victim or an aggressor.
Yeah.
This is, I think, a very plausible and good principle, but sometimes I have doubts. What's your view?
It's so interesting you asked that. I've been thinking a lot about this question. I don't know that I have an answer to it, but I have been thinking a lot about it. I was part of a discussion. Arthur Ripstein, you may know his work. He wrote something on this. He did a set of lectures at Berkeley that I was a part of, where he raised this question. And Tom Dannenbaum has also been doing some writing on this. So for those who don't know, the basic idea is that if you're a soldier in a war, as long as you follow the rules, the basic international humanitarian law principles, you can't be criminally prosecuted. Even if you're on the side that's engaging in an unlawful war and an aggressive war, you get the same protections regardless of which side you're on. And as you say, like in a way, it kind of makes sense because it's not really supposed to be the role of soldiers to have to determine whether it's lawful or not. That's, do we really expect soldiers to be able to do that? On the other hand, it is part of what enables unlawful violence because it basically is saying to soldiers, like, it doesn't matter to you if what you're participating is an unlawful war. You don't have any responsibility. And also, not only do you not have a responsibility, you actually don't have any way to challenge being ordered to fight in a war that you think is unlawful. I had a former student, Ellen Knoll, who wrote her JSD dissertation on this question. I think it's worth a lot more thinking. I don't know exactly where I would land on it, but it's definitely something I've been thinking about. One of the questions in looking at history for me has been, where did that idea originate? And I think in many ways it originated from an interest of the sovereign and just getting a lot of people to be willing to fight. And if what you want to do is constrain violence, maybe you don't necessarily want to make it so easy. On the other hand, I am also sympathetic to the individual soldier. So I'm wrestling with that myself. I think you're asking just the right question. Yeah, and no surprise.
Over there, the man with the two fingers has been very patient.
Martin Klink.
Klink.
Thank you very much for your great talk. We have seen erosion of the international law through terms of like enemy combatant and targeting killing. But isn't the biggest threat to international law AI? We already see weapons that are not managed by mankind, but by algorithms and technology. So how does international law can actually answer those questions when humankind is not responsible for the decision being taken?
You came to the right place.
Yeah, no, this is a really hard question. And in fact, like AI is already being used in war in a variety of ways. So it's being used in the targeting systems, which are, engage in adjustment in real time without any kind of human interference in that process. Many of us read the stories at the beginning of the war in Gaza. Reportedly, a lot of the initial targeting was done through AI systems. Thousands of strikes were done through AI, and the assertion, at least, is that it was based on a kind of algorithm that determined, how many touches you had on sort of with the Hamas kind of leadership and governance structure. But what at least the claim was that a lot of people who are basically regular bureaucrats, because of course Hamas was the government of Gaza, bureaucratic citizens were being kind of tagged in the course of that, which is kind of scary. The idea being that they weren't actually people that you would think were in fact targetable. I don't know if that's true, but at least that's the reporting. If that is true, it's really deeply troubling, and it's suggestive that we're headed down a very dangerous path. There's also talk of sort of like AI-guided drones, kind of individualized drones that actually have facial recognition and the like. Is not sci-fi anymore, but apparently like on the cusp of, and in fact being tested. So yeah, I mean, this is scary stuff. It's unfortunately like very real, and getting the rules right is only part of the answer. But getting the rules right is an important part of the answer, because you need to know, the AI systems are only as good as what you tell them to do. And what you tell them to do is guided by what you think the rules are. So having the right rules in place does play an important role. But obviously, there's a lot of efforts to try and bring, ensure there's a human in the loop and all these other kinds of rules. Again, those are imperfect, though. Apparently the human in the loop, at least in this, again, reporting, which I have no independent facts to prove or disprove, but the reporting is that the human in the loop was like a 10-second kind of assessment that didn't really allow for any kind of really detailed thinking about whether the targeting was proper or not under the kind of ordinary rules. So yeah, that's worrisome. And I think what AI is doing is just accelerating the situation that we're already in.
We are down to our last question, but the good news is that there will be plenty of time to have questions with wine glasses in hand as soon as we are done. But I'm going to go to Sebastian for another view from a government.
Sebastian, I'm working for the German federal government. Conceptually, it seems that you say the international humanitarian law line is still there. It has become blurred in recent years, but it still holds. And now this administration, is it willing to accept that there is that kind of legal standard? While in domestic US law, we now learn that there's all kind of constitutional theory that legitimizes all kind of presidential power and doesn't need Congress approval and all that sort of thing. And this administration tries to make a legal case for what the president is doing. Do you see that in this international law sphere as well?
And by this administration, you mean the Trump administration?
Yes.
Yeah. Just making sure.
Not the next administration.
Yeah. It's a good question. So they have not been. It's harder for me to read this administration than it is with Democratic administrations, partially because they just are not as clear about what their legal reasoning is. They are still trying to make arguments. Some of them are not very persuasive. They have put out an argument about the Venezuelan boat strikes, which I find implausible, but at least they're trying to make an argument. Both. Yeah. I mean, they're claiming that it's armed conflict and it's self-defense, and not a plausible argument, but they're trying to make the claim. And there are definitely good. I will say there's still some very good lawyers in the Department of Defense. And my experience working at the Pentagon was it's not just the civilian lawyers, but the lawyers in uniform who actually were the most vigorous defenders of international humanitarian law, because they knew why it mattered. They knew it mattered for them. And I also think that they felt like it mattered for their own honor. They believe in these rules in a kind of deep way. And so I think that's hard even for this administration to undo at a kind of basic level. But they're certainly determined to kind of throw these rules out the window. I think the problem, and part of the challenge I find and the frustration that I find is that we knew that the system was vulnerable in these ways. We knew that it relied too much on executive branch lawyers who are principled to make the right decisions at the right time, because there isn't any kind of like external constraint. We should have put in place some brakes earlier. But now we haven't done that. And now the question is, like, are other states going to be brave enough to criticize us? I think you should. And will there be internal critics as well? And I think that there still are people who are trying to make principled arguments within the administration. Their voices are not very easy to hear, and they're not speaking to those of us on the outside, but they are making these arguments internally. And to the extent that people are making, allies, important allies, are making arguments about that what we are doing is unlawful, you strengthen the internal critics. And so it is important to be making those arguments and be explaining why what's happening is wrong, if you think it is wrong, because I think it does make a difference internally, at least in my experience.
So the laws of war are in slightly better shape than the East Wing of the White House.
We're to be determined.
Okay, to be determined.